Ilia Topuria just called a fight with Conor McGregor a bad fight, not a dangerous fight, not a fight he is afraid of, not a fight he is uninterested in for competitive reasons. A bad fight, a shitty fight, those were his exact words. And the reason behind that specific word choice, the logic underneath the dismissal, tells you everything about where Topuria is mentally right now, what he believes his championship is worth, and what kind of fighter he is planning to become over the next 3 to 5 years. Because when the most dominant champion in the featherweight division looks at the most commercially valuable name in the sport history and says that fight does not work for me right now, that is not humility. That is a man who has done the math and concluded that his leverage is greater than McGregor's. That conclusion, whether you agree with it or not, is the most interesting thing said in MMA this entire week. Here is exactly what Topuria said, and it is worth going through carefully because every sentence carries specific weight. He called it a shitty fight, commercially. He acknowledged genuinely, without dismissiveness, that McGregor is one of the biggest stars the UFC has ever produced. He said the fight has pros and cons. And then he identified the core problem with the matchup as it currently exists. The only person who benefits from Topuria versus McGregor right now is McGregor, not the UFC. Not the featherweight division, not the sport's competitive integrity, not Topuria's legacy. McGregor, because what McGregor needs at the stage of his comeback is a Topuria name attached to it. The legitimacy, the danger, the championship stakes that transform a nostalgia tour into something that feels like a real competitive event. What Topuria needs from McGregor, in return, is significantly less obvious. He has already beaten the legends of this era. He has already made the statements that define a championship run. Adding McGregor to that list carries cultural weight, but cultural weight and competitive credibility are not always the same thing. And Topuria, who has spent his entire career building both simultaneously, is not willing to sacrifice one for the other. The only scenario in which he would consider making the fight happen is specific and demanding. McGregor beats Holloway. McGregor wins another fight after that. 2 wins minimum against elite opposition before the conversation becomes serious. For the most commercially valuable fighter in the history of combat sports to earn a title shot against a featherweight champion, he needs to prove that the version of McGregor showing up is a competitive one rather than a promotional one. That standard 2 wins, including one against Max Holloway, is Topuria essentially saying that he respects the name enough to require the fighter behind it to earn the opportunity, rather than simply existing as a box office draw. That framing is either deeply principled or strategically calculated to position Topuria as the man who made McGregor work for it. Probably both. His assessment of the Holloway versus McGregor fight itself is worth sitting with, because it is more honest than anything the promotional machine around that event has produced. He said McGregor is not much worse than Holloway at this stage. He called it 2 kittens touching each other. He noted the historical result. McGregor already beat Holloway once and predicted the same outcome. And then he said something that deserves more attention than it received, that he thinks McGregor will want to get some rounds in first after Holloway, build himself back up because he knows that in a fight against Topuria, he is going to take a lot of damage. That is Topuria describing his own threat level through McGregor's eyes. He is saying that McGregor, a man whose entire brand is built on fearlessness and supreme confidence, is going to look at this matchup and choose preparation over immediacy. If that assessment is accurate, it tells you more about what Topuria brings to a fight than any highlight reel could. Now step back from the Topuria and McGregor conversation and look at the broader landscape of what happened in MMA this week. Because there were several stories that deserve serious examination beyond the White House card noise. Colby Covington is officially off the UFC roster. He informed UFC officials of his retirement and was removed from the active fighter list. The career is over. And the response from Tyron Woodley, a man who has more personal history with Covington than almost anyone in the sport, who competed against him in 2020 and lost via TKO in the 5th round when a rib injury ended his night, was immediate, specific, and genuinely interesting as a piece of historical analysis rather than simply a personal attack. Woodley did not say Covington was a bad fighter. He acknowledged the results. He acknowledged the career. His argument was entirely structural, and it is the kind of argument that rarely gets made about fighters because it requires separating the performance from the moment in which it happened. Woodley's core claim was this: The sport was quiet at the exact moment Covington built his brand. Ronda Rousey was gone from the sport. John Jones was inactive and dealing with personal and legal issues that kept him off television. McGregor was out. The commercial stars, who normally consume every available unit of public attention, had temporarily vacated the space. And into that vacuum walked a man who understood something that most fighters never figure out. That attention is itself a resource, that it flows toward whoever is willing to be loudest when the room is empty, and that building a brand in a quiet moment is not the same as building a brand in a crowded one. Woodley called him an opportunist. He said Covington talked himself into positions that his record and ranking did not justify. He said the whole character, the Trump supporter persona, the America First branding, was an act performed by a man who was actually just a Drake-listening, Beats headphone-wearing guy who figured out what the market wanted and delivered it. That framing deserves honest examination rather than reflexive agreement or disagreement, because opportunism in sports is not automatically a criticism. Recognizing a window and walking through it is a skill. Being willing to do what other fighters are too proud or too conventional to do. Perform a character, court controversy, generate heat regardless of source, is a form of competitive intelligence that has commercial value even when it has no artistic merit. What Woodley was actually arguing is more nuanced than it first appears. He was saying that Covington's ceiling was set by the moment rather than by the talent, that the specific version of Covington that dominated headlines and main event pay-per-view cards was a product of timing, and that when the stars came back, the equation changed. Whether that makes the career less legitimate or simply accurately described is a question worth thinking about. The wins happened. The title shot happened. The pay-per-view appearances happened. The legacy is real. The mechanism that produced it is now, apparently, a matter of public record. Paulo Costa announced this week that the fight with Khamzat Chimaev is not happening. His reasoning was delivered with a directness that has always defined his public communication, and it did not hide behind the diplomatic language that most fighters use when discussing a matchup that has collapsed. He said Chimaev is done, not injured, not unavailable, done. He said the mental strength required to come back from whatever Chimaev has been navigating internally is not one of his qualities. He said there are a lot of problems for Chimaev to solve before he returns, and that he is not willing to wait around for a fight that may never materialize. And then he did what Costa always does when a door closes. He immediately listed every other door available and asked his audience to help him choose. Middleweight, light heavyweight, heavyweight, 3 names, 3 weight classes, 1 message. He wants to compete, and he is not going to let the absence of the perfect matchup prevent him from finding a good one. The willingness to fight across 3 weight classes in the same announcement is either genuine flexibility or strategic positioning to maximize the number of available opponents. Given that Costa has fought at both middleweight and light heavyweight in his career and has a physical frame to compete credibly at heavyweight, it is probably genuine. But the specific mention of heavyweight is the detail that catches attention, because competing at heavyweight represents a physical and stylistic challenge that goes beyond simply walking up in weight. The fighters at heavyweight hit differently. The margins of error are different. The specific combination of power and endurance that Costa brings may translate well or may encounter problems it has not encountered at smaller weight classes. If that fight gets made, it will generate significant attention regardless of opponent. Khamzat Chimaev's response to Arman Tsarukyan this week was delivered in the register that Chimaev operates in most naturally, casual, dismissive, and genuinely menacing in a way that feels completely unperformed. He looked at Tsarukyan's legs during a training session, noted their size with apparent amusement, and told his coach they would take Tsarukyan next once he was done with his current fight and give him a master class. The delivery was relaxed. The implication was not. Chimaev has been absent from competition for longer than his fan base is comfortable acknowledging. The questions about his physical and mental readiness to return at the level he competed at before have been sitting in the background of every conversation about the middleweight division for months. And yet in these informal moments, a training video, a casual comment about a rival's legs, he still projects a presence that is unlike anything else in sport. The gap between how he presents himself and the uncertainty about whether that presentation reflects his current competitive state is the most interesting unresolved question in the weight class. Darren appears to be in the best physical condition of his life ahead of his BKFC debut against Aaron Chalmers at BKFC 90. The trajectory of Till's post-UFC career has been one of the more genuinely compelling stories in combat sports over the last year. A fighter who never fully delivered on the enormous potential he showed early in his career, who battled injuries and motivation and weight and personal challenges throughout his time in the UFC, finding in bare-knuckle boxing a format that suits both his physical style and his personality in a way that the Octagon ultimately did not. The shape he is currently in is striking, not just athletically, but in terms of the energy he is projecting publicly. Engaged, motivated, focused in a way that his later UFC appearances did not always reflect. Whether that translates into performance at BKFC 90 is a separate question, but the version of Darren Till that is showing up to this fight looks like a man who has found something worth showing up for. The detail about Alex Pereira training with UFC heavyweight Taliesin Teixeira ahead of his interim heavyweight title fight against Cyril Gane deserves specific attention because of what it reveals about how Pereira's camp is preparing. The specific focus of those sessions has been eye pokes, preparing Pereira for the angles and entries that Gane's movement creates, reducing the risk of a fight-altering unintentional foul in a matchup where Gane's footwork and distance management are central to his game plan. That level of granular preparation, identifying a specific physical risk, finding a training partner whose physical profile approximates the threat, and drilling responses to it, is a kind of detail that Pereira's critics have not always credited his camp with. He has sometimes been portrayed as a fighter who wins on physical gifts and competitive spirit rather than tactical preparation. The Gane camp preparation suggests a more complete picture. The sparring footage that circulated this week, a training partner describing in specific detail what it is like to receive a liver shot from Topuria during a training session, deserves the final word here because it is the most honest piece of information that came out of the entire week of White House card buildup. The description was simple and unembellished. Topuria dropped him from a liver shot during what was supposed to be a controlled training session. He said he had to give up. That Topuria is just that good. A liver shot delivered with enough precision and power in a sparring context. A session where intensity is theoretically managed, where both parties are operating below full competition levels. That ends with training partner surrendering is not a normal outcome. It is a kind of specific physical evidence that explains why the men who have actually been in a room with Topuria speak about him in a register that is qualitatively different from how analysts who work from film speak about him. The film shows the results. The sparring stories describe the mechanism. And the mechanism, according to everyone who has been in that gym and experienced it directly, is something that statistical breakdowns and stylistic comparisons cannot fully capture. You can watch every Topuria fight in the database and understand intellectually that he is elite. You have to be in the room to understand why the people around him talk about him the way they do. The White House card is days away. The predictions are set. The trash talk is finished. The promotional cycle has run its course. What is left is the actual violence. And in a week that produced roster changes, retirement announcements, comeback speculation, cross-promotional drama, and a featherweight champion publicly dismissing the biggest name in the sport's history as currently insufficient, the fights themselves remain the only thing that actually resolves anything. Everything else is conversation. Sunday night is the answer.